What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Appreciate you guys tuning in for another video. If you guys are new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future videos. If you guys were looking for more content, check out our members only page. We got a few exclusive videos on there, some deep dive on some techniques and some really cool stuff. So check that out if you haven't already. All right, we're diving in talking about bass fishing around the spawn. So I'm going to tell you my favorite bait to throw regardless of the situation when you know that there is bass spawning. You know, generally speaking, that's going to be in the month of April, May, maybe in June if you're further up north. But for the bulk of the country, we're talking March, April, May, that time frame. And that's exactly what it is right now. It is the time to be throwing this bait when the bass are spawning. And there's a lot of different baits you can put on it, the rigging techniques. We're going to dive into all of that good stuff. So make sure you stay tuned if you want to learn about catching some more bass when the bass are up spawning. Okay, so this bait's not necessarily a secret, but a few of the rigging tips I'm going to give you may be a little sneaky that you may not have thought of before. But the bait that I am talking about is going to be the shaky head. You see, I got a full box, all different kinds, sizes. I mean, I got all different types of shaky heads in here, and really each one has its use. You know, I would say typically if you think of throwing a shaky head, you're thinking of putting a worm on it, you know, like a trick worm style bait, a finesse worm. This is a worm that I like to throw a lot. It's a little bit smaller and it's got a flat tail. So this is the Yamamoto cut tail worm. You see it's got a flat tail on there. So it just gives it a little bit of extra action. When that tail is on the back of a shaky head, it kind of catches the water and wiggles and swims a little bit different. So it's just a little bit different option. This is the 5-inch version of the cut tail. So this is one that, you know, I rig up on, you know, shaky heads a lot. You see I got all different kinds out here, and we're going to kind of dive in a few different baits I like to put on them and whatnot. But, you know, rigging a shaky head is extremely simple. Let's just walk through it for the guys who aren't familiar with the shaky head. So this right here, this is the Epic Baits shaky head right here. It's got a little bait keeper up there. So basically you want to rig your worm just so the head of that worm stays behind that keeper. So we're going to take our hook, go through just a little tiny bit of that worm, bring that hook out like that, slide him up. Now I like to spin him around like that because that's going to be the final placement of the worm like that before I slide him up over the keeper, so he doesn't rip up your worm. So slide him up like that. And now you're going to rig the rest of your shaky head. And this right here is probably what 90%, maybe more, 90+% of the time when you think of a shaky head, it's going to be with a worm style bait like that right there. And that'll catch fish. That's an excellent bait to be throwing right now. Excellent bait to be throwing when the bass are spawning right now. But for me, you know, I like to mix things up. You know, if I'm fishing highly pressured fisheries that a lot of people are throwing this little bait, you know, granted this is a pretty finesse style presentation. You're throwing this on light line, generally a spinning rod, you know, generally 8 to 12 pound fluorocarbon line on this guy. And generally they're pretty light, you know, 1/8 up to maybe 1/4 ounce is pretty much the heaviest you're throwing on one of these smaller style shaky heads. So generally you're fishing it in shallow cover, and you know, potentially you could be fishing behind a lot of people. And if everybody's throwing the same bait, if you could throw something a little bit different, it could help you get a few bites. And it's really important, you know, especially when the bass are spawning, they're not really feeding, you know, they're more so protecting an area. So you want baits that look extremely natural, you know, like a bluegill that could be sliding into their bed to eat some of their eggs or whatnot. So you want your baits to look extremely natural, and that's really what I do with my shaky heads here. So this is the worm rig right here. This is, you know, like I said, that's probably the most popular that you see on a shaky head. But another option that I really like, you know, when the bass are spawning, there's bluegill that are feeding around. I like to throw more of your soft plastic jerkbait style baits. So this is the Yamamoto D Shad. This is a Super Fluke Junior. It's basically the same style bait, just a little bit smaller. But this is more of your shad profile, but in bluegill colors. Like this is watermelon red. So this is going to imitate one of those bluegills that is kind of diving down to get in that bed. So, you know, rigging him up is the same as the worm. You know, you want to just go through slightly, slide him up over the keeper, rig him up right through the hook slot on the belly, like that. So now you've got a little bit bigger profile on your shaky head that looks like one of those bigger bluegill that may be sliding down into a bed. And you know, you can throw this around all the same types of cover, you know, stumps, rocks, laydowns, all that same areas, even in grass. You could throw this in grass. It's pretty weedless, a lot more weedless than you might think. And to catch a lot of those spawning fish, because this kind of swims a little bit different than a worm, has that little bit bulkier profile, bulkier sides, and really looks like a bluegill that's sliding into one of those beds on those bass that are spawning. So, you know, the options are endless with this. You know, you got all sorts of bluegill looking baits, you know, like the D-Shad, the Super Fluke Junior. Here's a little sneaky one that not a lot of guys think of right here, and this has caught me a lot of fish on highly pressured fisheries, and that's actually the shad-shaped worm. So this is the 4-inch shad-shaped worm, and we're rigging him up on a little shaky head. A little bit smaller profile than the one that I was just showing you. A little bit smaller hook for this smaller bait, but it's the same idea. You know, it's got that little bit rounder profile to it. Kind of looks like a little bluegill that's just kind of diving down into those nests. So, you know, the key with the shaky head is you got all of that weight forward. It's at the head, and your plastic kind of falls it. So you want that bait to fall head first. So when that bait hits the bottom, it looks like a bluegill that is nose down feeding on the eggs that the bass are protecting. So that's why a shaky head excels so well during the spawn, because it falls head first like that and stands up in that nest. And you know, if you can have a bait that imitates a bluegill better than a worm, it's going to help you catch some more bass. So these are just some sneaky alternatives that you can try this year when you know the bass are spawning. You know, this works excellent as well when you're sight fishing. This is one of my go-to baits for sight fishing. Actually, let's give you a little secret. Let's see, do I got any close by? We do. So this right here, this is some juice right here we're about to give up. And this is a bait that most people would never even think about putting on a shaky head, and that is just a tube. So this is actually a Bass Pro Shops tube. It's a 3.5-inch tube. But I love to put this on a shaky head, especially when I'm visibly sight fishing fish, because this can sit in there. You can use a bright color like a chartreuse or a white. You can throw a black. You know, you could throw a natural color like a watermelon red or a green pumpkin. But you know, rigging him is the same as all the other baits. But there's a couple sneaky tips you can use here. So slide him up over the keeper, rig him up the same way you would the worm, but now you have a hollow tube. It collapses really well, so you're going to get a good hookup ratio. But the cool thing about the tube is whenever that bait lands on the bottom, these tails kind of dance in the water by themselves. You don't have to put a whole lot of action in with your rod tip to let those tails dance around. So, you know, if those fish are sitting there looking at that bait and those tails start wiggling a little bit, it's an excellent way to trigger some bites. Now, there's one other thing I really like about a tube on a shaky head like this. You know, obviously a tube, it's hollow. So what you can do is actually take some scent and fill up the cavity of the tube. Squirt a little bit of scent in there, a little bit of gel, something like that, and it kind of oozes out as you're fishing that tube. It's not necessarily on the outside of it. It just kind of slowly disperses out the back of the tube. Excellent little sneaky bait that not a lot of people are throwing. So this bait right here, if you put a tube on a shaky head and throw him around the whole month of the whole period, the bass are spawning. Not necessarily a month, you know, that kind of changes where you're at in the country, like I said before, but overall, the shaky head is the best bait to be throwing when you know there is bass on the beds. Like I said, as far as structure, You could visibly be looking at the beds. You could see light spots. You could see dark spots. You could see a stump. You could see a laydown, a dock. I mean, you never really know where the bass may be spawning. Every fishery is a little bit different. But if you just throw this around those areas that have bass and that you're comfortable with, I promise you this will get you a few extra bites this year when the bass are spawning. So hopefully you guys learned something from this video. Appreciate you guys tuning in as always. Leave me those likes, comments, good stuff down below. Hit that subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll see you guys next time.